All right, well, welcome to the second panel. My name is Alan Hertzke, and I'm the moderator for this panel. In your program, you have the brief biographies of our panelists, so I'm not going to go into that, so we can move right on to the presentations. The panel is centered around the work of Dan Philpott, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Government at Notre Dame University and in the Joan Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. I guess it was a couple years ago, Dan did something that's very rare in the discipline of political science. He actually published a piece that seriously treated religion in the American Political Science Review, which, if any of you know insider baseball in political science, is a very secular organ, and it's been documented that we just don't talk about religion in the American Political Science Review, somehow he was able to penetrate that shield. But the important point is that Dan made an argument, a theoretical argument, grounded in empirical assessment about the importance to democracy of both differentiation between religion and the state and political theology, the set of doctrines that religious groups and actors may have. So we're going to have Dan Philpott offer his presentation, and then we'll have two panelists offer their critical commentary. So Dan Philpott.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. And again, it's a great honor to be here. It's always very heartening to see initiatives like Tom pulls together to have people come together and take religion and politics so seriously. Although I was asked to offer some remarks in the spirit of a social scientist, and will do that momentarily, I cannot resist beginning my analysis of what is in light of what my hopes for what might be a robust policy of promoting religious freedom in the Obama administration. Such hopes may well be ambitious. Thus far, hopes for a strong American foreign policy of religious freedom have not fared well. Human rights easily become subordinated to larger political goals. Just as the struggle against Soviet communism was said to justify alliances with various dictators during the Cold War, so too the imperative of fighting terrorism in Pakistan, Central Asia, and across the Arab world has muffled the cause that the U.S. Congress elevated in October 1998 when it passed the International Religious Freedom Act. But must human rights and security always be competitors? Might religious freedom and more broadly democratic regimes based on religious freedom, which is indeed part of what democracy is, as Tim argued eloquently, turn out not to be a goal that competes with and usually loses out to fighting against terrorism, but instead an integral strategy in that very struggle? The idea is that democracies based on religious freedom are more likely to be stable and peaceful, to encourage the democratic participation of religious actors, and to discourage the sort of civil war and terrorism that has religious roots. But if this proposal is going to be accepted as more than a hope, it must be shown to have solid foundations in global realities. So I take up again the spirit of the social scientist. Several assumptions behind the argument are ones that require empirical and theoretical support. I propose to explore them and then to return to the question of American foreign policy. Consensual differentiation. Admittedly, it does not roll easily off the tongue or glide easily into the ear. It is roughly what Al Steppen has called the twin tolerations, and means something like a composite of the American Constitution's religious freedom and establishment clauses, where both religion and state are happy with it. Sociologists have long talked about differentiation. Jose Casanova's work here is foundational. So using this concept, my first proposition is that terrorism is more likely where consensual differentiation is lacking and where religious groups hold political theologies that call for regimes that strongly privilege one faith. In 2005, there were 262 terrorist organizations in the world, according to the Terrorist Knowledge Base. By my calculations, 94 or 36% of these were identifiably religious. Of the religious ones, 91% carried a political theology that can be called radical Islamic revivalist. It is groups like these that have carried out the preponderance of attacks on the U.S., the World Trade Center in '93, the USS Cole, the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, and of course, September 11th. The political theology of these groups merits the name Radical Islamic Revivalist because it is rooted in the belief that Islamic civilization has descended into corruption, or jahiliyah, and that the solution is a revival involving both cultural change and political regimes based on Sharia law. At first, one might think that groups of this sort would be unalterably hostile to democracy, but not necessarily. Let us take a closer look at why revivalists decide to turn against the system rather than work within it. Most majority Muslim countries in the world today are governed undemocratically. Only 3 out of 47, Mali, Senegal, and Indonesia, are ranked free by Freedom House. About a quarter have democratic elections, though most in this group, like Pakistan, lack democratic freedom in other respects. Islamic authoritarian regimes, though, take two forms. The Iranian Revolution is the prototype for one version, of which Saudi Arabia and Sudan are also examples. But if authoritarianism prevails in Islam, Islam is not always the cause of authoritarianism. In fact, authoritarianism within the Muslim world stems far less commonly from the ideals of the Iranian Revolution than from those of the French Revolution, not least a form of secularism that involves strong government control of religion. The 1924 Republic of Turkey is a prototype of this form of authoritarianism, even regarding what Al has told us about. Al, maybe we could call it France on steroids. But this form can also be found in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, Yemen, Iran under the Shah, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and the Indonesia of Suharto. Some of these regimes have then now taken new forms, of course. But this subordination and sanitization of religion, what I call in the piece integrationism, proved to be just the atmosphere that radicalized revivalists and led them to violence and terrorism. Denied the role in politics that democracy can provide, not only were they marginalized, but they were never subjected to any of democracy's moderating effects. The practice of arguing and being argued against, the business of forming coalitions and brokering deals, and the open space in which their own theology can be debated and potentially revised. Both the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria are examples of revivalist groups that turn violent in the setting of secular authoritarianism. Aggregate analyses of contemporary terrorist groups reveal the influence of authoritarianism upon them. A Harvard study reports a strong correlation between authoritarianism and the risk of terrorism, while the Freedom House study shows that 70% of terrorist groups come from regimes that are considered not free, while only 8% come from free countries. Other analyses show that religious terrorists, in particular, are more likely to operate in settings where authoritarianism and integrationism prevail. Some of these using Brian's data. My argument is not that differentiation is everything. Within the same structure, different groups take up different forms of politics depending on their political theology. In Egypt, for instance, traditional Islamists have adopted both reformist and militant responses, both violent and nonviolent, depending on their interpretations of the Quran and the Hadith. Still, both the aggregate data and several salient examples suggest that structure matters. Integrated settings tend to encourage radical political theologies to form and then to take a turn toward violence. But if authoritarian settings that deny religious freedom beget violence and terrorism, this does not alone prove that revivalists or otherwise traditionally religious groups will participate in or be moderated by democratic institutions. Evidence is needed that such groups will respect the differentiated character of the regimes under which they live. Secular dictators, after all, like to justify their rule with the argument that they are keeping religious extremists at bay. Allowing Islamists to participate in democracy, they argue, will bring an end to democracy. One man, one vote, one time. As argued above, democracy is still relatively rare in the Muslim world, especially if one means democracy that involves not only elections, but the full set of freedoms set forth in the human rights covenants. But is Islam itself compatible with democracy? In fact, there is good evidence that seriously religious Muslims are willing to participate in elections and the democratic rule of law when given the chance. This provides support for my second broad proposition that democratic environments support the moderation and the peaceful participation of religious actors. Political scientist Vali Nasser has traced what he calls the rise of Muslim democracy between the early 1990s and 2005. In the Muslim-majority countries of Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Turkey, he shows, Islamic parties stood for election, won elections, often defeating, this kind of Islamic party, more moderate form, often defeating more radical Islamist parties, and were willing to stand for election a second time if they had lost. In all of these countries, the onset of a differentiated institutional environment both allowed and encouraged Muslim parties to participate in politics, and in fact favored those parties with a moderate but still substantively Islamic political theology. Nasser observes that most of the democratic movements he documents exist in the non-Arab world, underlying the secular authoritarianism of the Arab world. My third proposition is that religious actors who were once undemocratic can over time become more democratic and even a motor for democratic change. Numerous examples can be found in what is called the Catholic wave, in which national churches in countries like Poland, the Philippines, Spain, Brazil, and Chile were instrumental in ushering dictatorships towards democracy, following the Catholic Church's strong endorsement of democracy and human rights, most dramatically religious freedom, at its Second Vatican Council, a major development in political theology. Has something like the Catholic Church's trajectory towards democracy occurred in Islam? In Turkey, the very prototype of a statist regime, an Islamic movement has exercised significant force for democracy. Its political theology springs from the modernist Islam of the Nursu and Naqshbandi movements, rooted in a middle-class culture and Sufi spirituality, and committed to influencing society and politics as a civil society actor. It has been embodied in a succession of political parties that have pursued a differentiated politics in which they might participate democratically. But the Kemalist military has long made this differentiation a conflictual sort, not consensual, through its regular military interventions to suppress Islam. In the elections of 2002, though, a reconstituted Islamic party, the Justice and Development Party, came to power, espousing loyalty to European Union standards of human rights and democracy, and indeed advocating Turkish membership in the European Union. Turkey is still a long ways from the consensual differentiation of liberal democracy. The Kemalist regime's sharp control of religion is still in place. At least for the moment, though, a democratically minded Islamic movement has strengthened Turkey's democratic institutions, or at least moved them towards being more democratic than they were before. Here, ideas have evolved within and come to challenge integrated institutions. The other movement, Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama, represents a tradition in Indonesia of at least 6 centuries of separation between religion and politics in their institutional authority, supported by a doctrine that sanctions this separation and by a doctrine of religious tolerance. Over the past generation, NU, along with the Muhammadiyah Party, has come to embrace modern democracy in its political theology and then played a leading role in a coalition that brought down the dictatorship of Haji Muhammad Suharto and helped make Indonesia the third Islamic state to be ranked free by Freedom House. It is worth stressing that none of the propositions I have advanced is exceptionless or universal. Some religious groups will remain violent and supportive only of deeply illiberal and undemocratic regimes, even in democratic settings. But with a framework for analyzing the behavior of religious actors, policymakers might better be able to identify which ones are most likely to be agents of change. What, in fact, are the implications of the analysis for American foreign policy? It suggests that towards the Islamic world, a policy of placing greater pressure on regimes towards democratization and greater constructive engagement of Muslim parties and movements might well be a promising course of action, not only for America's goal of promoting democracy in and of itself, but for its policy of reducing terrorism. This does not mean a blank check. In environments where the U.S. seeks a thaw in authoritarianism, it ought to closely monitor groups like Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood and Pakistan's Jamaat-e-Islami, and be prepared to oppose and pressure them should they threaten to deny fundamental human rights. But the U.S. would also act with greater confidence that opening up space for the participation of religious parties can have a moderating effect on them, as well as on more extreme groups who have chosen violence. Some religious parties and movements can even be a force themselves for opening up authoritarian systems. But again, it is certain kinds of religious actors that are most likely to play this role. Ones whose political theology is likely to favor nonviolent democratic engagement, or have the potential at least, and ones who have enough independence to be efficacious even if their state is not yet democratic. That is, parties and movements in what I call the zone of conflictual differentiation, or in settings where democracy is just emerging, or in settings that are authoritarian but semi-authoritarianism, like an Egypt or a Turkey that is suppressive but also allows some room for religious participation. It's probably those kinds of environments that are most promising. Identifying such actors and such settings in return requires taking seriously the actors' most distinctively religious features, their doctrines, their particular relationship with the state, and perhaps other features like their organizational structure and their size. In his speech in Cairo back in June of this year, President Obama sounded several themes that promise favor towards this policy. First, he called for a broader engagement of the Muslim world, citing numerous achievements of Islamic civilization and stating confidence in the universal applicability of democracy and human rights. He also called for Islam to take strides towards religious freedom. So far, however, resounding Tim's passionate plea, his administration has shown little more inclination to pressure or even coax Islamic authoritarian regimes to open up their politics or to engage religious parties or movements that might be brought to participate in democratic politics. It is time now to translate the eloquence and vision of Cairo into a real strategy for supporting what is less eloquent, but nevertheless contains moral vision, consensual differentiation. Thank you.
One of the exciting things about this event is that so many of our foreign policy debates are structured around normative battles and competing assumptions and somewhat sort of tired schools of thought. And what we're presenting here instead is, I think, exciting new work, research that really is providing rigorous theories and empirical evidence that might help advance our foreign policy. And Dan Philpott's work is an example of that, and our next speaker's work, I think, is also an example of that. Brian Grimm, senior researcher at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, and also with Roger Finke, works with the Institute on Religion, Culture, and World Affairs at Boston University and Penn State's Religion Archives. Brian has been doing research over the past couple of years, rigorously analyzing the conditions under which governments restrict religion and societies restrict religion, and come up with mechanisms to actually measure those and then correlate those with other social goods like democracy, peace, stability, literacy, women's status, and so forth. This is, I think, powerful empirical work, and I'm going to turn it over now to Brian Grimm.
Thank you. My work has been focused on measuring restrictions on religion, which at the start I should say is a rather different thing than measuring religious freedom. Religious freedom I'm not exactly sure how you would measure a freedom. It all depends how much of resources you might have within yourself and what your capabilities of doing. Measuring capability for freedom is a different thing than actually what I set out to do. So in some ways, I have to begin with that caveat because the findings when you start measuring how governments restrict religion and how societies restrict religion appear a little bit differently than some of the findings you might find on some standard Freedom House rankings. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the work that I've been doing, I was asked, does looking at the data, does looking at these restrictions on religion on about 200 countries of the world and comparing it with other social scientific data on issues ranging from social welfare to other types of freedoms, does does the data more or less support the propositions being proposed here, that the twin separations seem to result in betterment for society? Does consensual differentiation, and I got it off my tongue, does that result? Do they correlate? Do they lead to better societies or not? So that's what I'll be talking about today, looking at some of the data. And first, let me describe the two types of measures that I'm using I'm using as a proxy for the things that they've talked about. And again, I'm talking about measuring restrictions. The first is restrictions that governments impose on religion in a society. And these range everything from constitutional restrictions that may not, first of all, not even provide for religious freedom in the country, or restrictions on certain types of practice. But it goes beyond that. Those are very poor predictors of overall restriction, because what's promised is often not what's practiced in a country. So we look at whether or not the actual policies of a government promote religious freedom. We look at whether or not certain things are restricted, such as proselytizing, the free ability to convert or change your religion, the ability to gather for worship, the ability to publish literature that you would like to publish in support of your own religious ideals. We look at whether or not governments offer support to one religion in such a way that it disadvantages others. So going beyond just whether a state supports some religion, but does it do so in an imbalanced way that unlevels the playing field, and it's an uphill battle for anybody who's not receiving the benefits in society. So we look at those kind of measures on government. For about 200 countries who's using 16 different sources, we ask a series of questions of these sources and try to code them up. So from that, we get a measure for each country on each of these variables. We look at about 25 or 30 different questions of the sort I've mentioned for governments, and about 15 different questions on societies. So on the social side, and that's a side that often political scientists don't look at as much as where I come from, sociology. So sociologists are more often, look from the sort of the bottom up, and political sciences tend to look from the top down, and how do these things. So from the bottom up, what are the ways that groups in society may be restricting the free practice of religion? How are they enforcing religious norms on the population with or without their consent? Are they showing violence towards certain religious activities, such as conversion? If one of their members converts, do they react violently to that? Also looking at things such as terrorism, religion-related war, hate crimes, religiously biased hate crimes. All of these have a powerful effect on a country. If one person is killed because they've converted, well, that's one death, that's not much. But if that's picked up by the media, if people start knowing that, then these can have dramatic effects. So even these small social events can have a power beyond the significance of the event itself. So we measure these things also for 200 countries and develop indexes where we can then compare them. So the first bit of data that I'd like to share, and then to get to the first punchline, is that they do support the arguments that have been advanced today, that the more a government restricts the free practice of religion, the greater the level of religious hostilities exist in society. So whenever the accumulated restrictions of government become higher and higher, as these measures add up, they do not just 1, 2, or 3, but they do 10, 15 of the different measures at a high degree, then we find that there tends to be much more religious violence in society. And some research that I published with Roger Finke and the American Sociological Review looks at trying to explain this interaction. And what we found, and you can look at it in the article, is that once there's some type of social restriction placed on religion, governments often respond by trying to solve the problem, trying to regulate it, solve it through more restrictions. And then that leads to greater religious violence. And then once there's more religious violence, religious groups may respond by reacting against that violence, leading to more government restrictions, and the cycle continues. So that's sort of to the punchline of what they're saying. Whereas if you look at low government restrictions, the opposite side, looking at it from the opposite way, when government restrictions are low, there tend to be less grievances by religious groups in society, less hostilities. They have more freedom to operate. There's less incentive to go out and commit terrorism, some of the themes that were talked about. So as these restrictions are lowered, there's less grievances, and we find that there's less violence in society. And so that we've done structural equation modeling, looking at this, controlling for all kinds of alternative explanations, from the clash of civilizations, developing measures to see to what extent that exists in a country, controlling for the economies of countries, controlling for whether there's a war in the country. And so these findings that we have are robust across the number of countries that we've looked at, which are most of the countries of the world. Now, when we start looking, though, at some of the individual measures, that's where the nuance starts coming in. So in looking at first the correlation between government restrictions on religion and the longevity of democracy. So on that question, one of the interesting, well, I can put it in I have a PowerPoint that goes with this where I can put my data, so I'll have to use what you did. I'll use hand symbols to show what's going on. Yes. But if we look at the 25 most populous countries in the world and look at the number of countries that have high restrictions high government restrictions on religion, and how many of them have had a democracy for most of the last century, only 7 out of the 10 have had a democracy that's been sustained throughout most of the past century, according to the measure from Freedom House. So those with high government restrictions on religion tend to have not had a very long-standing democracy. The 3 exceptions in the 25 most populous countries are India, Indonesia, and Turkey, where they've had some democratic institutions, and Freedom House rated them by the presence in 1900, 1950, and 2000, whether or not they were democratic institutions and whether or not they were restricted or full. And so those 3 had squeak into having a little bit longer-term democracies. But as I go through a couple of the other findings, they are exceptional on some of the other things where they don't show freedoms. So those 3 on our scales also show very high levels of government restrictions on religion: Indonesia, Turkey, and India. Some of what Tim is talking about, often it's at the either certain aspects of religion are highly regulated, such as in India with the Islamic personal law and the personal law of all religious groups in India, sometimes at the state level, such as in India, in Indonesia, where you have you have Aceh province that's instituted Sharia law and the stoning, and so it may be picking up these restrictions that are in certain parts, but still are under the purview of the national government. So we'll look at some of the exceptions for those 3 countries. And the one country I would like to point out that's been a success story in the 20th century that went from a regime of total religious control to what appears to be consolidated religious freedom and democracy is Japan. Often not talked about in religious freedom or these kind of meetings because they actually haven't had too many problems recently. But it was more or less a theocracy where the emperor was the divine being in the country. They followed him to war, or he followed them to war and gave it a religious blessing in World War II. And then when that was deregulated, when the emperor no longer said, follow what I say for what's done militarily or politically, religious freedom was consolidated in Japan. And some of the challenges that Japan has faced, like the Aum Shinrikyo sarin gas attacks in the I think 1995, this was what I would count as a social restriction or social regulation. This group had a messianic view of Buddhism coming back in to reconquer the world, and they attacked Tokyo subway stations with sarin gas, and some scores of people were killed and more injured. But the government response to that was interesting. Rather than coming down and outlawing Aum Shinrikyo, the government instead prosecuted those who participated in the attacks. They took away some of the tax privileges of the group itself, looked into their finances, but they didn't stigmatize the group itself. They didn't stigmatize Aum Shinrikyo as a cult, as a bad religion. They just went after the criminal activities. And to this day, Japan has been dealing with the challenges in this way. So as we look at some religious freedom advances in the 20th century, I'd encourage you to consider Japan as an interesting case study. Well, looking at some of the other data, as was talked about, having a democratic regime is more than just having elections. So it involves a lot of other types of protections and other types of liberal policies, such as on freedom of the press. So looking at government restrictions, comparing the level of government restrictions with the level of freedom of the press as measured by Freedom House, we find, again, another high correlation. Where there's wherever you have high restrictions on religion, you'll find high restrictions on the press, which shouldn't be too surprising in that both are based on freedom of speech, based on being able to say your own dissenting point of view, both being based on being able to organize and propagate a message. So there's a high correlation between speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion, or put negatively, the way that I measure it, when you have high restrictions on religion, you're going to have also high restrictions on the press. And again, interestingly, again coming back to Indonesia, Turkey, and India, all three of them tend to have higher restrictions on the press than many of the other Western democracies. So they tend to be outliers on that measure, at least as measured by Freedom House. Another measure of a democracy is whether or not the country is ruled by law, whether there's a strong tradition of laws being followed as opposed to just administrative actions determining what's done, whether or not there's good protections for minorities, whether or not these things, you have an independent judiciary. So Freedom House has a measure on this, taking into these kind of things into account. And again, the correlation between high restrictions on religion and high restrictions or high limits on the rule of law is strong and very significant. And again, India, Turkey, and Indonesia come out more in the moderate to high range on that measure from Freedom House. And again, matching what we see in the restriction of religion. Another question, and this is the one that often democracy promoters focus on, is whether or not there's a good electoral process. And on this measure, again, we do find high correlation and significant correlation between high restrictions on religion, government restrictions on religion, and very high limits on the electoral process. These things are highly correlated. And on this measure is the one measure where Indonesia, Turkey, and India score on the free range, or have low limits on this process. So in terms of one of the things that's being measured, those three countries are very strong. They have low limit. They have a good electoral process. And I should say, for Japan, on every one of these measures, it scores at one of the, however you want to put it, the freest or the least restrictive on every measure that I'm talking about. Okay, and then the next measure, you may have seen the Failed State Index that's been published in Foreign Policy magazine. And so looking at this, looking at the correlation between failed states and high restrictions on governments. Now, the interesting things that go into Failed State Index they look have some interesting parallels with what we look at, or at least correlations with what we look at in restrictions on religion. Failed states, as they measure it, are predicted by whether there's huge demographic tensions or movements or problems, and demographic including religion. They also look at whether or not how minorities are treated and whether there's group grievances developing within a country, and they found that, or at least by their measure, when these things are stirring, there's a higher likelihood of state failure. So again, not surprisingly, where we find high restrictions on religion, we also find a higher likelihood of state failure as measured by this state failure index. Again, I'll say one thing on correlations, that correlations are like age and size. If you're little, you're probably young, and if you're taller, you're probably older. But there's exceptions to that. So as I talk about correlations, keep that in mind. However, as correlations keep adding up, then it starts to paint a picture. And I have one last bit of data to mention, and then I'll talk about areas, with the minute or two left that I have, talk about areas of future research that I think would be productive. The last is on the relationship between GDP as measured, or GNI actually, GNI, gross national income, using purchasing power parity, where they make the dollar equal for what you can spend it on in a country, comparing it to another country, that we find that that's also negatively correlated, meaning that when you have high income, you have low restrictions on government. And where you have low incomes, you have higher restrictions on government. However, that picture's a little more nuanced. If I had my plot up here, you would see countries clustering in the low category of income all across the spectrum of restrictions on religion. So that you can have some very poor countries, Senegal, being in the religiously, having low government restrictions on religion, whereas you can also have some other very poor countries, like the Maldives, being way up at the top in terms of restrictions on religion. So you have this whole spread, which I guess the first point that I could say is that having low government restrictions on religion is not determined by having a lot of money to spend in your country. So you can be a poor country or you can be a rich country and still have low restrictions. So the economic situation just by itself doesn't determine the level of restrictions. However, the 10 most prosperous countries out of the 10 most prosperous countries out of the top 50 most populous countries. So looking at the 50 most populous countries, the 10 most prosperous all have moderate or moderately low restrictions on religion, and there's no rich country that has high restrictions on religion. So the correlation is there, it's a bit more nuanced. Now, the last thing is where are some areas that the research should head? Much of the research I do is at the macro level. I look at the micro activities within countries, but case studies, why are these things happening? How are these things related? I've indicated a couple ways that they are, but who's written on these things? Is there a book that delves into why these things might be correlated and then does good statistical testing to see is it a spurious correlation, or are these really patterns where religious restrictions on religion actually are resulting in some negative outcomes for societies, and how might that be part of the mix? I think that I'll just end with this one. Freedom of the press and freedom of religion are very close bedfellows, but the press aren't necessarily always that friendly to religion. And I think that getting some of this information out to people in the press, to journalism students, to those who look at communications is very important to understand how all of these freedoms are tied together. They're not identical. Each has its own separate set of issues. But once you start saying, okay, your freedom's not important, mine is, then we may be missing the solution to some of the world's tougher problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our last panelist is Haris Mylonas, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University. And his talk today is going to focus a little bit more specifically on violence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to thank the organizers, but also all of you for coming and the fellow panelists. So I'm going to focus on something more specific on what I would call political violence and the effect of religion on that. And by political violence, I mean something that is slightly more gory and intense than, or in terms and bloodier than what Brian focused on. Building though on both of your work, Brian's and Professor Philpott's work. I'm going to ask the question: what is the relationship between religion and political violence, and whether religious communities are more likely to basically rebel against integrationist rather than differentiated states, building on this typology we heard. So it's perfectly building up on what you heard already, so I don't need to cover too much space, too much distance to get my message across. So a little bit of an overview. First, I'm going to make a distinction between religious motivated violence versus religious cleavages that are present in violent situations. Then I'm going to discuss violence as a tool rather than just as a moral category, let's say. So violence as a technique, a strategy to get goals. And this sometimes gets conflated. Third, I'm going to talk about the wide variation in religious experiences that complicates our usage of the term religion as an undifferentiated category. Fourth, I'm going to speak about some facts. And fifth, I'm going to talk about policy recommendations and conclude with some future research points. So first, a distinction that all of us are making, but it's not very clear in the press and in the popular media especially, is that people, when they're talking about religious violence, they usually conflate violence where the religious cleavage is prominent, where the warring sides are recruiting on the basis of religion, basically, or they are basically identified on religious basis, with conflicts that are for religious ends. And that is a very dangerous conflation. I think it's one that is misinforming a lot of our policy recommendations. So just to give you a sense of why this is important, out of the 33 ethnic conflicts that took place in the past 12 to 13 years, according to the PRIO data sets and some codings by Wimmer and his colleagues. This is technical stuff that only in political science are relevant. I guess you don't care about who did that. Only 9 out of them, that's according to my coding at least, only 9 of them could be considered religious. So from 1995 basically to 2005, we can identify 33 ethnic conflicts, so conflicts that were not on class basis or some other type of coups or all this other stuff that goes on. And they were identified as ethnic. Now within them, there are all types of ethnic groups and all types of ethnic identities. Religion is considered as one of those in those studies. So the religious dimension was important either as a motivation or as a cleavage in 9 of them only. From those 9, 5 were basically just a religious cleavage. It was only about the identity of the actors. And only 3 were unambiguously about religious ends. So, and those religious ends were not necessarily always to establish a theocracy as we tend to believe. It could be against a theocracy. Which brings me to my second point about violence as a tool. Violence can be used, the meaning of violence is not always unambiguous. So in other words, we're all confronted in our own personal histories and traditions with situations and incidents in our history that we consider as glorious and we're often even proud of, that were really violent. I bet that each and every one of you have some violent incident in their mind that they're very powerfully in favor of, very strongly in favor of, like a war of independence, or a religious conflict that was won by the side of your own religion, or something like that. And we shouldn't forget that. So violence could be used both to promote goals we feel dear about, and violence has been used to promote goals that we don't like. So it's not as clear morally, and you know, Professor Elstein has more to say, I'm sure, about that, but I just want to raise that as an issue. The third thing that Professor Philpott has very much made a point to today and in his work is that there is a huge variation in religion in terms of doctrines, or what he calls political theologies, or structures, whether a hierarchy in an English pronunciation of that word, I guess, with being Greek, I always mispronounce. There is always, sometimes there are some churches that have transnational networks and some they don't, and those are important differences. You cannot talk about religion and religious organizations the same way, putting the Catholic Church next to the Greek Orthodox Church, those are not the same type of organizations. Their goals, which goes back to political theologies, their practices, proselytism proselytizing being more accepted in some religions than others. Of course, that historically has changed, so we should focus on why these things change over time or not. Can we have such an impact on certain religions or not? And so forth. So all these are some caveats in when just about when we're discussing this correlation between religion and political violence. Now, let's go to some of the facts. I already mentioned some of the facts, but I'm talking now about the causal facts. Do we know more from our research in political science and sociology about the relationship between religion and political violence? Definitely, Brian made a clear point that we do know more because of thanks to his research about this lower level conflict, and definitely those are great findings, and I think they definitely shed light to very important processes. But when it comes to these higher, more bloody, let's say, situations, we have so few cases. The number of cases so little. Thank God, maybe. That we cannot really have very strong statistical findings, and we cannot with certainty make causal statements. We can have some correlations, and I'm going to talk about some of these findings today. I was so dissatisfied by my own analysis that I prepared for today that I'm not going to even present it, but I'm going to tell you what other people that were satisfied with their analysis said. So that I have no sin on my on my back. So basically, the existing data, starting with a very famous in political science finding of Fear and Leighton in 2003, another APSR article, American Political Science Review article, that is the most cited article on Civil War onset. They claim that they test for the impact of religious fractionalization on the onset of Civil War conflict, and they find that after controlling for GDP, they find no effect of that. Now, the problem here goes back to my initial remarks, is that they measure religion and the impact of religion just by looking at whether a country has a lot of religious minorities or not, basically. So basically, a statistical measure, measuring whether a country is religiously diverse. But which I already have pointed out, this is not, this is conflating religious ends with religious cleavage, and moreover, there are so few cases of religious ends and religious cleavage conflicts that it's not surprising they don't find an effect. Now, they also claim that they test for what Brian is coding for, basically discrimination or favoritism of a specific church or religion in a country, And it's kind of ambiguous how they do that because they only had the codings from 1998 survey. So I'm still in contact with the authors to get their data, but they also find that this is not a predictor. So that finding goes against both Professor Philpot's finding, although I don't know how exactly it came about, and Brian's research. It's still left open to discussion though, because if I have the data, I could corroborate or run his data, Brian's data, against their measures of civil conflict, and then we can adjudicate this debate, because I think they're having a time invariant measure of religious discrimination that they're trying to explain a time-varying outcome, which is conflict. So I think they coded with 1998 data. This is getting too technical maybe for some of you, but basically they're using one measure of religious discrimination, let's say, to explain conflict across 45 or 50 years. So it might be problematic in that sense. It seems so, at least, because they claim they're basing their codings on 1998 data. So I'm not clear on this, but more will come soon from me, I hope, on that. Now, some people from Europe have done some research on this, and they have found things and findings that corroborate actually Professor Philpot's hypothesis, going against, to an extent, the received wisdom from the Fear and Latin research. Nor does, in 2004, studies the relationship between religious heterogeneity, religious regulations, and civil wars from 1990 to 2002, which is arguably a period where religion has been, the impact of religion has been reported by Jonathan Fox and Monica Toft and others as increasing in intensity, and your work as well. He finds that religious cleavages, and that's why the initial remarks are important, religious cleavages do not by themselves explain civil wars. So in that sense, he corroborates Fear and Latin. But he also finds that in countries that have a religious cleavage along world religions, so Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and so forth, the probability of conflict increases when the state has an official state religion and the state persecutes religious minorities, which builds well on what you heard before, right? That's not surprising to some of you, obviously, but it's a finding that is statistically coming up with a lot of controls. It's not just a correlation in this case. So that's the important part of this, is that the controlling for a wide range of other variables, including GDP, regime type, and other things, this is a strong finding. These findings, as I said, corroborate Philpot's findings that communal violence is advanced by groups with integrationist political theologies, sometimes secular in character, who capture the state and impose integrationist institutions upon minority faiths who then rebel, and by integrationist religious groups who take up oppositions to states. So now again, the ambiguity of the goals of the actors is also still there, and that was my second point about violence not being unambiguous in its usage. Now, there is also evidence that the religious cleavage seems to be increasingly more salient in the last 4 decades, as I said. Toft has shown that the number of religious civil wars has increased as a proportion of all civil wars, Jonathan Fox as well. Also, studies have also been conducted whether the intensity of violence in religious vis-a-vis non-religious conflicts is higher. So how bloody are they? Norders conducts an analysis, and he finds that religious conflicts are not bloodier overall. Interestingly, Islam does not seem to be associated with bloodier conflicts. Toft, however, looking at all civil wars, and he only focuses in the last, in the 1990 to 2002 period. Toft is looking at in the second half of the 20th century, and shows that more than 80% of religious wars involve Islam, and she explains this overrepresentation by the fact that whereas the largely Christian West has rejected the idea that violence in the name of religion has a positive utility and that the church and the state should be the same, Islam and its adherents have not rejected such notions. So the jury is still out with respect to the bloodier or not, but definitely there is some work on that, and definitely we need more. Now, when it comes to, so I'm going to propose a different way to look at the relationship between religion, democratic stability, let's say, and social harmony. So regime type does not seem, as we heard, to explain basically whether we're going to have more or less restrictions. The codings are kind of mixed there. And also GDP, as we just heard by Brian, really does not explain much of the variation. There are so many outliers in terms of religious restrictions and so on and so forth. So I suggest that religious unmixing has only partially taken place, and this has only been a consequence of nationalist self-determination movements. So basically, there are billions of Muslims, Christians, millions of Hindus, Buddhists, and Jews. But what is most important for our purposes, I think, is that the believers are not neatly arranged across states. So it's not that each state has its religion, right? So and that's not surprising coming from someone who is studying nationalism. So more religious identities have not always coincided with national identities. A German can be a Protestant or Catholic, an Indian can be Muslim or Hindu, an American can be Muslim, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and so forth. Of course, prominent cases do exist where religion and national identity are coterminous. Poland, Greece, Israel, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia are just few states that come to mind. However, most people in the world live in religiously diverse countries. Taking this fact into account, the importance of regulation of religion becomes apparent both for social harmony and the quality of democracy. So religious claims and nation-state claims sometimes nicely complement each other, but often are at odds with one another. I argue that the degree of congruence between national identity, religious identity, and state boundaries largely accounts for the variation in the salience of religion in political life, and also the potential for conflict. And I'll skip the hypothesis, but you get the idea, right? So the ultimate hypothesis that religion is more likely to lead to conflict in countries where there is an official religion of the state and discrimination against smaller religious minorities, basically repeating Philpott's intuition, but coming from a different point of view almost. So grievances and discrimination are necessary, but not sufficient conditions for political violence to occur. The size of religious minority, its spatial distribution in the country, the history of past conflict, as well as its capacity to mobilize or receive external support, which brings us back to the hierarchy and transnational networks of certain churches rather than others, are all critical and they can render the necessary conditions sufficient for conflict. So going over to policy implications, building on what I said of this congruence or the lack of this congruence, I think whether or not various indicators capturing the regulation of religion and society have a statistically significant effect on the probability of political violence should not hinder our study of religious components of conflict. So the religious cleavage is important in many societies, even though we have so few conflicts, I'm saying, that are religious. And it is the cleavage around which the conflicts occurs. So understanding the process of politicization of such cleavages around which conflicts occurs is important. So in other words, there are many places that have a religious diverse population, but the religious cleavage is not the most important one in that society, as we heard earlier in that panel, in the earlier panel as well. So class, ethnicity, caste, region, or nation might be another component, another cleavage that can trump, that can undermine the religious cleavage and its importance. So a preliminary answer for why there is such a variation is that some societies have overlapping cleavages, as I said, where religion overlaps with ethnicity, class, region, or caste, rendering the cleavage an intense cleavage, which can lead to violent conflict. Other societies have cross-cutting cleavages, where people who share the same religion, identity, religious identity, with different ethnic groups or regions of a country, are less likely to have a conflict of that sort. So how can we, policy-wise, how can we actually create these cross-cutting cleavages, or how can the Obama administration promote more cross-cutting cleavages? To conclude, because I guess now I have like 2 minutes, and I don't want to delay Afnar's
We need to have
talk.
some time for questions.
Yeah, exactly. So the most common path is that of modernization. It has been broadly proposed by many people, including my professor, Juan Lins, and Al Stepan. I won't go into that. Another path to create cross-cutting cleavages requires political engineering, and that's very pertinent with respect to what's going on in Afghanistan right now in terms of elections and Iraq and so on and so forth. So for instance, if we're focusing on a democratic state, we know that certain types of electoral systems lead to more or less incentives for cooperation across different electoral colleges and regions. So moreover, proportional representation is a system that would allow even small groups to be represented as such without any real incentive to cooperate with other groups. Depending on the ethnic and religious landscape of a country, a well-designed electoral system can provide incentives to ethnic entrepreneurs for cooperation with other religious and ethnic groups. And that's very well known in political science, but it seems that in politics it hasn't completely been implemented yet. More often than not, such a process could lead to a creation of cross-cutting cleavages and decrease the salience of religious cleavage. A third part has to do with civil society. A lot of this has been already discussed. I won't go into this. So what are the recommendations for future scholarship? So religion, basically, the conceptualization and the operationalization is really lacking, and I already talked about that. I think in order to test the effect of consensual differentiation on political violence, we need to code all religious groups across the world along the dimension of differentiation between religious communities and the state. And then basically this way we can also have more robust global measures for state institutions regulating religion along the lines that Brian Grimm and his associates are doing. And then we can test for potential endogeneity problems, selection bias problems that are all over the place. So basically getting the direction of causality right and basically being able to adjudicate between some of the problems that Dan mentioned earlier. So disaggregation, careful conceptualization, measurement, extend our periods of coding, conduct process tracing, and focus on the timing of events and processes. And thank you. Yeah.
All right. We have just a few minutes for some questions, so I think we'll throw it out to questions. Yes, right here in front. Who's got the microphone? Oh, you got someone. Okay, and then we'll go to Jean. Okay.
Okay. My name is Mevi Rutviana Hermawanti. I'm originally from Indonesia. So when you guys discussing about Indonesia, it's interesting to me. I'm from George Mason University, PhD candidate. I have a question about, when you discuss about Islam and democracy, I think it's interesting to look at it when Indonesia is the process of a transition to democracy, while at the same time we face a lot of violence in Indonesia. It's not only caused by great and grievances, but it's also caused by a lot of religious issues. So my first question to all of the panelists is, while in this situation, the rise of Islamic conservatism in Indonesia increased at the same time when we already have a democratic election just this past July, and Islamic political parties never won so far. So my question is that any relation between the rise of religious conservatism in Indonesia and the process of transition to democracy in the country? Thanks.
Who wants to take that on?
I have one comment. I can't, of course, address the whole question, but one example, there was a fatwa issued against the Ahmadiyya community, which is a sect of Islam, which was then declared by a government-sponsored Islamic body to be un-Islamic and illegitimate Muslims. So the Ahmadiyya community in Indonesia was then, in a sense, by this fatwa banned as a legitimate practice of Islam. And then related to that, there was an increase in violence against Ahmadiyya mosques. The largest one was burned down, numerous others are burned, and a rise of violence. So one observation that I have is that these things are often linked. When some government agency or an agency supported by the government can issue these proclamations, then it in a sense says, any responses to that might not go punished within society. So there's often a connection between social violence related to religion and some government policy that's been promulgated, and in this sense, a government restriction.
Any other comments from the panelists on that?
Well,
Okay.
I don't think it was
Okay.
addressed to me.
Okay. Jean?
Yes, Professor Mylonas is right that I do have something to say about the category of violence as you were using it. And I'm wondering just how helpful that category is, if it's a big global concept that covers everything from, say, the American War on Independence to the Madrid train station bombing. It seems to me that one would want to differentiate between, let's say, the use of force on certain occasions in an activity that is more or less rule-governed and aimed at non-combatants primarily, and a situation, and is preceded often, as you know, by attempts at political negotiation and even civil disobedience, let's say, by contrast to a situation where none of that pertains, and what you've got instead is an action that aims to kill as many non-combatants as possible. And to call all of that violence, again, seems to me not too helpful, but one would need to disaggregate that category and to talk about, again, use of force on certain occasions and then violence in a more sort of anomic situation that isn't under any of the constraints, let's say, that the use of force between states is, for example. So maybe you have something more to say on that.
Yeah, that was great because I couldn't go into depth in that. So basically, exactly, I agree completely with you. I was basically raising awareness of the audience and hopefully more people that will listen to that at some point or read about it, in the sense that when we look at these statistical correlations or causal statements that come from those, we don't realize that they're very a very diverse set of cases is grouped under the term conflicts from 1945 to 2005. So just to give you a sense, the Chechnya War is in the same category. It's basically in the same data set with the Kosovo War and the KLA, or the War of Independence for the Kosovo Albanians, and in the same category with conflicts in Iran of people that or conflicts in Afghanistan, the Taliban wanting to get control of Afghanistan lately again. So all of these very different types of attempts are undifferentiatedly lumped under conflicts, so violent conflicts. And that's the way that this is happening. And clearly people like you and Walter and others that have written on just war theory and all that have no input in this, or they have no influence on this. And I'm just raising this awareness. I don't think it's easy to solve this problem. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Celia Belin from the Middle East Institute, and I had a question maybe more for Dan Philpott. In your research, what do you believe is the part of the doctrine versus the circumstances in the making of a political theology? In other terms, what do you think it is? Is it the structure of the religious group or the doctrines of the religious group that are more prone to the emergence of violence or to the emergence of democracy? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in my study, I try to make a case for the force of two different kinds of influences. One is the doctrines or political theologies of religious groups, and the other is the kind of context in which they find themselves in terms of the relationship between the religion and the state. And but I certainly don't, I think of the movie The Graduate, where the guy tells the graduate it's all plastics. Well, I don't certainly mean to say it's only two things that matter. I think the size and the structure and the relative size of a religious group in a nation, lots of things like that matter as well. Nevertheless, I want to say that I think that there is something kind of many people ask, well, if I think that religious ideas and doctrines matter, well, where do those come from? As if something else causes them. And I guess I want to answer that in kind of a subtle way, and that I think that religious doctrines have a kind of autonomy or power of their own, that ideas have a kind of internal logic that can't be reduced to something else. But nevertheless, they evolve and they are shaped by historical circumstances. So, a great example is that I'm familiar with is the Catholic Church's evolution towards its embrace of religious freedom. On one hand, the people who debated religious freedom, this was an intensely theological debate, and there were intensely theological matters at play. People like John Courtney Murray were involved, and others who said, no, you can't compromise, religious freedom would be compromising the truth of our theological claims and so forth. So that was one kind of conversation. But on the other hand, it is undeniable that the evolution of religious freedom, the reason why it came about when it did, had to do with history and circumstances. It was certainly a kind of a dialogue with the Enlightenment and with the modern world. It very much had to do with the circumstances of the church and under communist regimes, where it now found itself very much oppressed and needing to assert its freedom to operate and so forth. Had to do with, I think also after World War II, democracies like France and Italy and so forth, restructured their constitutions such that now religion could have a friendly place. And they started to see that, yes, we can survive and flourish in democracies. I think the American experience was profound in that respect as well. So I think, doctrine is a kind of a combination of, core theological claims as well as, an interaction with historical circumstances.
Well, we'll take one more question from Professor Stepan.
Hold on. What is he? Excuse me. I'm asking a point of information from Brian Grimm, and it's point of information about Indonesia, because you mentioned that freedom of the press was low on your score. I just finished 2 different conferences with about 20 scholars, and we listed a whole range of huge problems in Indonesia. Freedom of the press never came up. So I'm wondering, what is your time? Do you know what time period you used?
I didn't code that. That was coded by Freedom House, and that was for 2009. It wasn't high. It was in the moderate range. So it wasn't, but it wasn't on the free. They didn't put it down on no problems. It was more, there's moderate problems in freedom of the press in Indonesia.
No, I'll take a look at it. Everyone knew that it was always a big problem under Suharto. Never as big as it was in many other places, because he always had tempo and had about 5 good publications that existed, which is important. And then it became vastly better, but I'll look into it.
Okay, well, we need to break, but let me just say thank you to our panelists, because I think they've given us extraordinarily rich material to think about with respect to foreign policy. And if perhaps we didn't sharpen those implications, I think certainly those who follow up with whatever will come out of this conference can do so, because I think Brian and Dan and Horace all have very important things to say about the implications of empirical work on our foreign policy and the kinds of things we'd want to promote as a country. Thank you very much.
Is this something you do